Greetings! Today I'm going to talk about some techniques with Ableton's Looper device. This video is basically a follow-up to my previous video about using Ableton's Looper to replace real physical loop pedals for super tight, reliable looping to click track. And this is some extended techniques that you can use when you're doing that. Just going to jump straight into this. One of the benefits of working in a digital environment like this is I can insert as many instances of the looper device as I like, so I could effectively have the equivalent of 20 loop pedals in front of me with ease. So this is my full Ableton live set for all my Final Fantasy VII cover tracks arranged in the arrangement view of Ableton, and I'll just give you a quick scan of what's in here. At the top are all of my instrument tracks. You can see my guitar channel is here. If I just play something there. Oh, hang on, there we go. That's my guitar where that lives, and then this is Pocket Piano track. These are all like MIDI parts that get sent to my little Pocket Piano synth. Pad perks are for my launchpad, so I can play different finger drumming parts on my Ableton launchpad. That's another track of just more of those basically. So down here are all the backing tracks. If I go to In Search of the Man in Black, and I'll give this a little playthrough, and I'm going to re-enable the drums. These are my guide drums program with addictive drums, but they're quite useful to have in here as a reference. I can just turn them on and off when I want to. So these are all the guitar tracks that are muted because I'm going to play them live. So I want to be able to loop up guitar parts to that perfectly tightly and in time, and I'm going to be able to do that with Looper here. But if I keep playing the song, you'll hear that it basically has, there's two different sections that I want to loop two different guitar parts for. In total, the song has 3 sections, so let's call them Section A, Section B, and Section C. There are guitar parts, different guitar parts in Sections A and B, and Section A is this whole sort of bit here, right? So it's the whole, like... And then later on, so the structure of this song is basically, it starts with Section A, goes to Section B, then it goes into a Section C, and then Section A comes back again at the end, right? So I've got different guitar parts that I want to loop up in Section A to what's happening in Section B, but then for the Section A, I want that to come back again later on in the arrangement without having to re-record all the parts again from scratch. I just want the looper to play, and if I only use one looper to do this, then I'll basically overwrite whatever happens earlier on. I'm not sure if I've explained that well, but just to quickly show you what the parts are that I want to loop up. I'm trying to emulate the harp part. In the original harp part, there's basically 2 different things happening in Section A. You've got this... So there's that offbeat note, which is like... And then underneath that, there's like an ascending scale arpeggiator, which goes... There's actually 2 different ways to play that. Today, just because I'm on my own, I'm having to play it one note at a time, kind of staccato-y, so it sounds quite plucky, but you can hear in the original part, it's kind of more like a harp, and there's more sustain between each note, and the way that you would achieve that on a guitar in normal standard tuning is to have a capo on the 5th fret, and then you just hold down the 12th fret on the A string and the 9th fret on the D string, and then play. So that makes it possible to play that. So you get that kind of like sustain and the notes ringing out there. I won't be able to do that today because obviously that's only the first half of that arpeggiator part. So to get the next bit up, you would need a second guitarist with a capo on the 12th fret, and then you would play... Oh, that's actually quite difficult to play. So yeah, obviously because that's not practical today, I'm just playing it like this. So it's not as harp-like, but we'll just sort of roll with it for now. But yeah, I'll just sort of show you what happens with the looper. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to call that looper 1, now looper 2. Basically, if I go to my guitar track, which is here, so I have these looper 1 and looper 2 here that I can show you the automation. So if I go into that, so I'm controlling the state of the looper 1 here. Absolute state of that, mate. But yeah, here the looper's behavior is going to sort of follow what I've got penciled in here. So I'll just show you what that sounds like basically. So it's playing my loop there, and then at this point it's going to let me overdub the next part in. Here it plays. And then when it gets to section B, I want this looper to stop, and then looper 2 is going to kick in so I can record the next part in over it. And you can see it stops there. And if I change back to looper 1 here, you'll see that later so that was just doing some silly glitching out with the guitar part at the end there with beat repeat, which is set up on my instruments bus up here. You can't really see it, but that's just applied to, that's a group of everything that I'm playing. So my keyboard, my synths, my guitar, all come to this instruments bus, and then I have a beat repeat effect there that I've mapped to manual control of those glitches. So for example, I can actually that's just something I like to do a lot. That's a lot of fun. So yeah, you can see basically what happened there was my loops for section A stayed stored in looper 1, so they didn't get overwritten when I went to that when section B kicked in, because looper 1 just stops here, and then it's looper 2 that kicks in to deal with that second section. And just in terms of what the parts are of that section, so the idea is it's meant to be emulating the harp part in the original song. So there's this like, hang on, it's really beautiful. Hang on a sec. So. I've split that one harp part up into 3 different parts on the guitar to play each part of it more staccato. So the first loop of that, or the first part, is this up here. And then there's this one. And then there's this one. So those 3 layered together give you the harp rhythm and those chords. And like, I could have learnt to play it as the full chords as it is in the original MIDI, but you wouldn't get the same kind of staccato, nice math rocky plucking sound that you would get if you record each part of that melody line individually with, obviously I'm using a loop to do this here, but if you were playing this live, you would have one guitarist play the top part, another guitarist playing this part, and then another third guitarist, or, you know, one of you's using a loop pedal and then one of you has got to cover. So yeah, that's kind of like how you would achieve that kind of part on guitars, basically. So the other thing that's advantageous about this, obviously, so in this track, at certain sections, the reason I'm using the looper is to give myself time to switch to playing keyboard and playing. There's a theremin part and like a piano part, and yeah, to give myself time to change between instruments. It's really useful to have loopers set up to cover these parts for me like that. What I'm going to do now is just kind of quickly reposition the camera so that you can see the keyboard a little bit more, and I'm just going to do like a playthrough performance of this, kind of to show you how that works, essentially. So that's my theremin sound, which is, if I go up here to this LX61 track, my keyboard is a Nectar LX61, so it's just this track corresponds to everything happening on this bad boy. These are all the keys, sounds, all the plugins that I use for the entire set, and then I've got automation to turn those on and off at specific moments for specific songs. It's ARP 2600 here. So, and that will also change to the piano 5 midway through. When I get to section C, I'm going to change from theremin to piano, which is pretty cool. And all the guitar looping stuff will still be going on as well. Okay, there may have been a little bit of a weird jump cut in the angle here. I've come back to this a week after initially filming. When I first did this, I decided to do it with really old, rusty strings on this guitar for some reason. So I've come back to this with some fresh strings, and it sounds a lot better. And the other thing that I was feeling was this sort of arpeggiated guitar part, I think, was sounding a little dry and empty. And just to kind of show off another function of this, I've automated my delay pedal in Archetype Cory Wong to turn itself on. Don't want the delay on that part, but for my, I want that to so that basically turns itself on exactly when I need it to, and I just feel like, yeah, that kind of fills out the sound of this a lot more. So that went pretty well. You can also hear there that in the middle section I kind of changed from the clean tone to a heavier sort of djenty guitar tone, and I'm doing that again just using automating the speaker on off between Archetype Petrucci and Archetype Cory Wong. So I'm using Cory Wong for like the clean tones, and then it kicks over to Archetype Petrucci for a sort of heavier tone in that middle section there. You might have noticed there that there was a couple of loops that kind of abruptly stop, like they just cut off. It might sound a little bit weird here in my direct Ableton session. When you hear this in context with a live drummer and stuff in a room, it actually serves a purpose, and you don't really notice it sounding that digital when it's actually live, basically. So it is possible to set your loops up so that they have a bit of reverb trail on the end when they stop, but I've deliberately avoided doing that in this session just because things are meant to sound like sudden stops between one part and the next, if that makes sense. The other thing that I'd like to show you is, since I started filming this video, I've had a few rehearsals with my drummer, and I've managed to get a little bit of footage of us playing this exact song together. So I thought it was worth sort of switching over to a bit of my iPhone video footage just to show you what it actually sounds like in a real room, you know? The whole purpose of this is to kind of make looping with a band or other musicians like a drummer really tight. Nothing ever drifts out. So to kind of put the proof in the pudding and, you know, not just have this be talked about in theory, I thought it was good to actually just show it. So I'm going to switch over to a bit of that footage now. Somebody brought it up in the comments on one of my previous videos, and I just thought it was actually a really interesting thing to kind of talk about, and that is, you know, what if you make a mistake in this situation? I would say that there's two main scenarios where a mistake could occur in this kind of thing, and that is either scenario one is you play all the notes perfectly and you know, guitar's in tune, everything sounds fine in that regard, but you mess up the loop and it starts to drift out of time with the click and everything goes out of time that way. In terms of dealing with scenario one, this is what I think this is the advantage of using loopers and Ableton over a physical real loop pedal. As an example of how things can go horribly wrong this way, here's a real time that this exact thing happened to James Blake performing his track Retrograde. I've actually recreated the opening of this track in Logic to show what I think happens here. I don't mean to cast any shade or be rude here at all, and I really like this song. I think it'd just be a bit educational almost to explain what happens and how to avoid it, and this is an example of a real performance that I can think of, and I've recreated it in Logic with the click track superimposed over it, which I think helps a lot to sort of explain the facial expressions of some of the band members at certain moments. I've used different colours for these regions to illustrate where the drummer and the vocals are actually happening and being played live, and then when they go to these darker regions here, that's the looped version of it. Please excuse my terrible vocal, that opening part is very hard to sing. If anybody's curious, I've just used Soundtoys' little alter boy on my voice there with Valhalla Vintage Verb. And here is the point where it goes wrong. So, You probably noticed what happened there, especially with the click. It's not that noticeable in the video itself without the click. Let me just play you it again without it. It's like... It's pretty subtle. Piano doesn't get looped. James Blake is still playing that live, and you can see he actually did something quite clever there. He accounted for what happened, and he's actually disregarded the click track. He seems to be now not listening to that, and he's focusing on the hi-hat, and you can see he pushes his keys. Ideally, that's where the hi-hat is meant to start again. It's meant to come in, bang on that grid value, but for whatever reason, the trigger point of the start loop happens just off of that one there, bar 28, right? So these vocals and the hi-hat loop are now sort of like playing offset to that click. The absolute worst thing about this issue happening is the issue just compounds as the song goes on. So the next time the loop happens, it's just going to get worse. It probably just got worse and worse throughout their performance, so... And obviously it doesn't really impact their performance because they go on to complete the song. And obviously James Blake is pretty huge, so I guess in the grand scheme of things it probably doesn't matter too much. But I don't know, I just reckon, you know, if you can, it's nice to be able to minimise the chances of things going wrong like that.
Yeah, you didn't do your looping right, mate.
So yeah, if you use this system of Ableton as a live looper, then you're basically just not going to have that problem of loops ever drifting out of time with your metronome. You know, you can send this click track, but you could route that out of some separate outputs from your interface and then send that to the in-ears of your drummer, for example, and your drummer will be listening to this click track perfectly in time with your guitar looping, if that makes sense. So yeah, you shouldn't ever really run into that scenario of things drifting out with the click. Scenario 2 is the looping goes perfectly fine, but you play some absolute, you know, you play some horribly wrong note in there, and it's just like every single time the loop comes back round, it sounds awful. So let's demonstrate that. So if you do this, you know, like... Alright, that's really dumb. Obviously you probably wouldn't do that, but you know, there's a possibility that you could play a wrong note on the first time this comes in. So what I would do in a phrase like that, because it's literally just this offbeat note, it's quite easy to deal with that kind of part. So where I've got this set to start recording as soon as beat 1 of section A happens, right? So starting to come in right there, but sometimes it's like it can be useful to set the looper just a little bit later, and what that basically does is it gives your hands kind of like, you know, time to warm up to the muscle memory of playing that part, so you're not recording the first bit of it and your very first attempt. You know, you kind of have a few bars where it's not recording. That gives you time to get used to the feeling of playing that part, and then it will start recording. So let's see what that is like. And there you go. If you think you're likely to make a mistake and you think that's a possibility, you know, you can just save yourself by setting the record time to happen a little bit further into your riff, or for example, So yeah, you can see that obviously because I set my loop times to start a little bit later, it kind of gave me time to mess up and play a bunch of horrible stuff, which is just obviously me pretending to kind of make a mistake on the start there, but obviously you would never go. Well, I don't know, you might if you were Omar Rodriguez Lopez or something, but yeah, anyway, that is about it in terms of how I can think of effective ways to deal with making mistakes. The only other thing I would say is that having this system with everything laid out like this, and I know exactly where all this stuff is going to happen, I find that really helps me to get rid of any kind of performance anxiety and just play. I don't have to think about when I'm going to turn things on and off. It's just all going to happen for me at the exact moments where it kind of logically is meant to in the song. So it really just means that I can totally focus on playing the guitar and then switching to keys. Obviously, like I don't have to worry about having to quickly press a button whilst I'm coming from, you see there's a couple bits where, I have to get quite quickly from the guitar to playing keys. And if I had to worry about, making sure that my instrument patch, it's just not practical, is it? To try and press a button, get the sound in the right place at the right time. Yeah, that's just why using loopers can be really useful as well, just to kind of give yourself a little bit of a moment to give yourself time to use your hands basically to do anything on keys-based setup. Little stroke. Thanks very much for watching and take it easy. Hopefully catch you in the next one.